So let's start out by creating our Next.js application. I'm going to store mine in a directory named blog, but feel free to name yours whatever you like. And once I have the blog directory created, I want to open up my terminal. And once our terminal is open, let's cd into that directory. So now in order to start up the Next.js application, I'm going to type in the command npx create -next-app at latest. And we want to install it inside of this directory, so we'll do space// and press enter. Okay, so for this particular video, we're not going to use TypeScript. We will use the ESLint. We'll say yes to Tailwind CSS. We'll say yes to the src directory. Yes to the app router directory, or yes to the app router, And would we like to customize the default import alias? We're going to say no. And we're going to let the application finish its installation. Okay, so now that the installation is complete, let's go ahead and type in a few dependencies that we're going to need with today's application. First one we're going to use is bcrypt. This is going to help us with our username and password encryption. Next is going to be jsonwebtoken. This is going to help us manage our web tokens. Next will be mongoose. And this is the adapter that we're going to use to interact with our MongoDB database from our Next.js application. Next, we're going to use Next-auth. This is going to help us with authentication. React icons, just to give us some styling for icons. React Toastify. This is going to help us with notifications. And then last but not least, timeago.js. Timeago is going to help us with capturing timestamps. Make sure, and I just realized with bcrypt, make sure that you're including bcrypt.js. Okay, and once you have these typed in, go ahead and press enter. And if for some reason something doesn't install, we'll either see an error, or as we're building out the application, it'll let us know that the dependency or the module can't be found, that we can always go back in and install it or troubleshoot as needed. So now that we have these dependencies installed, let's go ahead and make sure our Next.js application is working. And we want to type in the command, in order to start up our application, let's type in the command npm run dev and press enter. And as you type in that command, just make sure that you're in the blog or the directory that you installed the Next.js application. And then once the server, and as the server is starting up, you should see where and as the server is starting up, you should see what local host your application will be on. Mine is going to be on localhost 3000. And if we navigate over to our localhost 3000, we should see that we have the Next.js application up and running. We should see that we have the Next.js application up and running. So now that we have our application up and working, the first thing that we want to do is set up our API logic, our backend logic. This is what's going to allow us to interact with our MongoDB database and build out the routes and schemas that will be needed in order to create our blog posts and our user authentication and registration. So we'll go ahead and work on that now. So with our Next.js application up and working, let's go ahead and set up our database. For today's video, we're going to use MongoDB Atlas. MongoDB Atlas is a free service that allows you to store your database within its cluster in the cloud. So once signed in, you should be redirected to your project window. From this window, you want to click on New Project. Now you should be directed to the Create a Project screen. You'd just like to name your project. I'm going to name mine Blog, but feel free to name yours whatever you like. Next, you're going to be asked to confirm the permissions of the users for your database. I'm going to keep the default user here, Create Project. Once you've created your project, you'll be redirected to the database deployment screen. On this window, what you want to do is you want to click on Build a Database. And MongoDB offers a few different options as it relates to database tiers. Feel free to review their options to see what best suits your needs. For today's video though, we're going to click on the free tier, And if you scroll down, just make sure that the region is the closest region to you. And you also have the option to name your cluster if you wish. I'm going to keep mine as the default. And once you're satisfied with all of your entries, go ahead and click on create. Once you've clicked on create, you'll be redirected to the quick start security window. Here is where you'll create users to give access to your database. I'm going to keep the default username but update my password. I would suggest you do the same thing. And if you scroll down to the bottom, once you've created your user, next you'll need to grant access to your database via IP address. Normally it will default to your IP address, but feel free to make changes to whatever you're comfortable with. Once you have those two items updated, you'll be able to click on finish. And once your database is finished setting up, you should be redirected back to the initial window, this time with the ability to connect to your cluster. So we're not going to do much from this window just yet, but the first thing that we do want to do is go ahead and grab our connection string. So in order to grab it, let's click on connect. And at the very top, we want to click where it says drivers. And we'll need to go back and we need to make sure that we install MongoDB as well. But the main thing that we want to capture from this window, under number 3, we're going to see a connection string listed here. Go ahead and click on the copy button to the far right hand side to grab this connection string. This is what we're going to use inside of our Next.js application in order to connect to our database. So once you've clicked copy, go ahead and close that window out. And we'll navigate back to the Next.js application and set up our connection string in the next portion of the video. So back in our Next.js application, let's go ahead and store our MongoDB connection string securely. So let's create a file within our directory, within the root of our directory, named .env. So within this file, we're going to store our MongoDB Atlas connection string. So let's type in the variable name mongo underscore URL. And right here, we want to paste in the connection string that we got back from MongoDB. The main thing that you want to do from this file is update your password. Make sure that you keep this information secure because someone can go in and compromise your database if they have access to it. So now that we have our password updated within our MongoDB Atlas connection string, let's go in and make sure that we add our .env file to our gitignore file. That way this information is not stored freely in GitHub. Next, let's go ahead and create our connection to MongoDB. So inside of our main project directory, we're going to have a folder named src. Let's go ahead and right click on that src folder and let's create another directory named lib. Inside of the lib directory, we want to add a file named db.js. Within this db.js file, this is where we're going to store our connection to MongoDB. So within the db.js file, here's where we want to store the function that will connect to our MongoDB database. First, we want to start out by importing mongoose. Then we want to make sure that we export the connection, and I'm going to export this. I'm going to name my function db.connect. Next, we want to add in the connection string that's going to store our connection. Then we want to create an asynchronous function, or we want to create a function by the name of dbconnect that we've already exported. Within this db.connect, we want to make sure that we have a connection. If we have a connection, we want to make sure that we return that it is connected. And then just to make sure that we're able to connect using the MongoDB URI, we want to establish a try-catch block, We'll create a variable that's going to connect the MongoDB using the URI. Make sure that we're passing in all of the security connections. Then we'll add in the connection piece that's going to make sure that it's in the ready state. And then from here, we just want to console.log that MongoDB is connected if all is successful. And if it's not, then we'll console back that we have an error. And once we have all of our information typed in, let's go ahead and save our file. Now that we have this database connection set up, let's go ahead and build out the models that we'll use in order to store our information within our database. So with our connection to MongoDB in place, let's go ahead and build out our models. So back inside of our main blog directory inside of the src, let's create a folder named models. And inside of models, here's where we want to store the 3 models that we'll use, or 3 schemas I should say, that we're going to use it to interact with our database. The first schema or model that we want to build is our user schema. So we'll create a file named user.js. So within our user.js file, this is the model or the schema that we want to build that's going to store our users. We will need to encrypt our passwords, but in order to just build out the user itself, we'll need to capture some information. So first, let's go ahead and import Mongoose to interact with the database. Then we'll create a user schema. Next, we want all of our users to enter in an email address. We also want to have our users create a username as well. And we want to make sure that these 2 items are stored as string and they are required. And then lastly, we want to ask that our users create a password. This password, again, is going to be encrypted with encryption, but we want to make sure that they're typing in a password so that not everyone can access their account. And we want to make sure that we export this schema from this particular file. The next model that we want to set up that we'll need within our models directory is the post model. So let's go ahead and create a file named post.js. So within our post.js file, this is the file we're going to use to build out the actual blog post. So first, we want to make sure that we import Mongoose. Then we want to create our post schema. Inside of our posts, we want to make sure that all of our posts have a title, that it's going to be stored as a string, and we want to have at least a 4-character requirement. Feel free to adjust that to whatever suits your needs. Next, we want to have a description. This is just going to be the main post or the main content of the post itself. Again, it's going to be a string. We're going to ask that it's required, and we want to have a minimum character of at least 6 characters. Next, we're going to have categories. These are categories that's going to allow us to organize our posts. For this particular project, the categories that I elected to use were sports, money, news, text, and programming. Feel free to use whatever you like. The key for a category is to make sure that you're using the enum option. This is something that's provided from the Mongoose that's going to allow us to interact with the database. So if you're going to use a category or want to have multiple options that's restricted, use the enum option. Next, we want to have an author ID, and if you notice the type with this one, object, this object is going to reference back to the user. That way, each post that's created is going to be referenced back to a user so that you can see the user that created that post. And eventually, we'll add a author page or a user profile page that'll have all posts, but for right now, we're just going to have the post and see who created that post. And then next, we're also going to have the ability to like posts. Likes, the type for likes is also going to be an object ID. The reference is going to be a user as well, but for likes, we want to store those in an array so that we can keep up with all the likes that we have, just in case we're popular and we have more than one like. And last but not least, we want to make sure that we're storing the timestamp. This is where time ago is going to play a big part. So we're going to make sure that we're capturing that timestamp so it's easily for us to provide that information within the post. And then we want to make sure that we're exporting the model as well so that it could be used within our API directory. Once you have all of this information typed in, go ahead and save it. And the last model that we want to create is for our comments. So let's go ahead and create a file named comment.js. So within the comment.js file, we want to make sure that we bring in Mongoose. Then we want to create our comment schema, and comments are going to have a post ID. These are going to be referenced back to the initial post itself. Next, comments also have to have an author. These are going to be tied back to the actual users that have created a profile within our blog. If they wish to comment, it's going to automatically grab their author ID so that we can tie that comment back to a user. The next thing we want to have within the comment schema is the text. This is going to represent the message from the user. We want to make sure that we're capturing the timestamp of the comment as well. And then last but not least, let's make sure that we're exporting this comment. Now that we have our model set up, the last step in completing our back-end setup is setting up the API routes. Let's go ahead and do that next. So to set up our back-end APIs, we're going to use the built-in capabilities from Nextjs, the API directory itself. So if we navigate to our main blog directory inside of the SRC, we should see a folder titled app. So within the app folder, let's go ahead and create a folder named API. And this is going to represent the API connection or our backend connection. The cool thing with Next.js is we could do all of this within the Next.js application itself. You could have elected to add this code within the actual file for the page itself, but I would prefer to have it stored in a different location. That way you can have the code separated. So within the API folder, we're going to create quite a few different folders, so just hang in there with me. And the key here is just to make sure that you have it structured correctly, because these are going to represent the actual routes itself for our APIs. So the first route or folder that we want to set up is register. And let's go ahead inside of the main API directory as well, just to make it visually a little easier. Let's create a folder named post. So for right now, we're going to just focus on the register folder. So in order to create this register route, the next thing we'll need to do is create a file inside of this register directory. The name of the file that we want to create is going to be route.js. So within the route.js file, here's where we're going to store the API to register our users. So first we'll need to bring in the user model. Then we'll need to bring in bcrypt to encrypt our passwords. And then we'll need to also make sure that we bring in our MongoDB connection, as our users and our password will be stored in MongoDB. From there, we want to create our asynchronous function, and the method that we want to use is going to be the post method. Then we want to create a try catch block to make sure that we don't have any errors. And first thing we need to do is go ahead and await the connection to our database by accessing the database connection from our lib directory. Then we want to grab the user email and password that's entered by the user, and this is just using some JavaScript destructuring. Then if the user exists, we want to make sure that we send a message back to the user saying, hey, this username already exists. You're going to need to elect a new one. And then if it doesn't exist, then the next thing we want to do is go ahead and hash the password. This is part of the encryption process. And once that password is hashed, we want to go ahead and create a new user. Then we want to create the new doc for the new user. This is going to allow us to store that information and reuse it throughout. Then we want to return, and if all is stored and saved well, we want to return a response back to the user set of status of 201, which is basically saying that everything worked as designed or there were no errors. And if we do, we want to make sure that we send an error 500 back to the user, indicating that there was an error with the connection to the database. Let's go ahead and make sure that we are reviewing it to see what happened. So once you have all of this information typed in, we can click on save, and we now have our registration API route set up. Route that we want to set up within the API directory is our login route. So for our login or for our authentication, we're going to use Next-auth. And in order to use Next-auth, we'll need to create two special directories that come directly from the Next.js or the Next-auth documentation. first is within the API folder, let's create another folder named auth. And within that auth folder, we need to create a special folder from Next-auth that will need to look just like this. The way you want to set it up is bracket, 3 periods, Next-auth, and then the closing bracket. So that's open bracket, 3 periods, Next-auth, close bracket. Then press enter. And within this folder, here's where we want to store our login API information. So let's create a file within that Next-auth folder named route.js. So before we work with our route.js within our login authentication, we'll need to set up our JSON web token functionality so that we can use it to encrypt and unencrypt our passwords to confirm that our login connection is correct. So before we type in this information, let's go ahead and navigate back to our lib folder and let's create a file named jwt.js. So within this file is where we're going to store 2 separate functions that's going to perform the verification for the sign-in verification for us. So first, let's go ahead and import JWT from jsonwebtoken. And the first function that we want to create is to sign in with JWT. And this information is kind of boilerplate functions that you can get directly from the documentation. The main thing that we'll need to grab from this particular file as you're storing it is we'll need to create a JWT secret, as you see listed right here. And we're going to store that within our .env file, and we'll work on that after this. But after you've created the first sign-in JWT token, the next thing that you want to do is create the verified JWT token. And this is just to verify that we have the right information. So of course, with all things, we want to create a try catch block just to make sure that we're capturing any errors. First, we want to identify our secret. It's going to be the secret that's stored within the JWT inside of our .env file that we're going to create in a moment. Then we want to create the payload, and the payload is going to be to verify the token and secret. And if all goes well, we want to return payload. And of course, if we get an error, we want to console it and just return null that we did get an error. So now that we have this set up, let's go ahead and copy this JWT secret. And what we're going to do now is we're going to create this secret within our .env file. So let's just make sure that we save this file and close it out. And let's navigate back to our main directory. And if you click, so now that we have our .env file, let's go ahead and create the variable. Let's go ahead and create that JWT_secret variable. And what we want to store here is our JSON web token secret. There isn't anything in particular that you have to name this. Just make sure that you name it something unique that no one else would be able to identify. And then while we're here, we'll need to create 2 more variables in order to use our Next-auth. So the first one that we're going to create is Next-auth_secret. This is what's going to be used to help with our Next-auth connection. And then the last is going to be the Next-auth_URL. We want to set this variable equal to our local host, just letting Next-auth know that this is the URL that will be accessing, that will be utilizing the Next-auth feature. So once you have this information filled out, go ahead and click on save and close out the file. So now that we have the environment variable set up, let's go ahead and navigate back to the route.js file within the bracket ... Next-auth folder. The first thing is to bring in all of the appropriate dependencies. So we'll need to bring in Next-auth. We'll need to bring in the credentials provider. We'll need to bring in the user model. We'll need to bring in the JSON sign-in, JSON web token function that we just created. We'll need to import bcrypt for encryption, our database connection as well. And once we have that information brought in, then we'll need to create our Next-auth handler. This is just boilerplate information that you can find directly from the Next-auth site itself. Let's make sure that we are exporting the get and post handler because we'll need to utilize both. Then we'll need to use the providers. Here's if we were using one like Google or Facebook or Instagram, we could use those here. This application will just be using a username and a password. Connection to, we want to authorize the connection with Next-auth, and it's going to destructure our credentials that we entered in, establish the connection to the database, locate the user by email. If there's no user, give the error back to the user saying that that was an invalid input. If there is a valid input, we want to compare the passwords. And if those passwords do not match, then we want to throw an error. Otherwise, we want to grab the password and we want to identify this user as the current user. We want to give the access token based on the jsonwebtoken, and this we're going to set up so that it expires in 3 days, but feel free to adjust it to whatever you like. And then if all goes well, we want to return the current user with the access token. And the page that is going to be designated for the login, we're going to make ours the login page, and we're going to create this inside of our Next.js application so that it knows that, hey, this is the page that is going to be storing this information. And then our callbacks, our callback is going to be with JWT. And if the user has access, we want to grant the token and identify the token ID as the user ID, and just make sure that we're returning that token so that it could be stored. Then we want to set up our sessions as well. If we have our token, we want to create our session ID. So now that we have all of this information typed in, we have our registration and login API route set up. Once we wrap our application with the provider, we should be able to, and set up the appropriate front end, we should be able to do registration and login without an issue. So now that we have these API routes set up, the next routes that we want to set up are our post routes. Back in our main directory inside of the SRC inside of API, let's go ahead and let's work with the post directory. We're going to need two different endpoints. The first endpoint is for the post itself. So let's go ahead and create a route.js file that's going to be within the post file itself. The second endpoint that we're going to need within the post is the actual unique post ID itself, or the individual post itself. So let's just say that we want to click on the post and get more details about the post. We need to have a separate route created uniquely for the post. This is where that post ID is going to come in. So with Next.js, all we need to do is create a directory with the bracket ID. That's going to represent the ID itself inside of the post folder. So let's go ahead and create that now. And inside of the ID folder, we're going to want to have more endpoints as well. The first endpoint is going to be for the actual post ID itself. So let's go ahead and create a file named route.js inside of the ID directory. And inside of the other directory that we're going to need inside of the ID directory is to like a post. So let's go ahead and create a directory inside of ID named like. And inside of like, this is going to be the like endpoint for this individual post. Let's just go ahead and create a route.js file within it. We have quite a few files within the post endpoint, but just to kind of recap, we have an endpoint named post, and then within that endpoint, we have the post endpoint. So we have an endpoint named post, which is going to have a route that's going to care for the actual post. Then we're going to have a unique post ID route, which is going to care for a unique post itself or individual post. So within the post directory, we have a few endpoints. The first endpoint is going to be to get all of our posts. That's going to be the route.js file that's directly inside of post. The next endpoint is going to be the individual post. that is going to be the post ID. And inside of that post ID, you have the ability to like a post. So we created a folder named like, which is going to represent the like endpoint. So the first endpoint that we want to work on is the route.js within the post itself, which is going to represent get all posts. So let's go ahead and close out these directories so that we're just within the route.js file that's within post itself. So within our post route.js, we're going to create two functions. The first function is going to be to get all posts, and the second function is to create a new post. So first, let's start out by bringing in our database connection. Then we'll need to bring in the post model. Now let's bring in the two JSON web token functions that we created, because we'll need to confirm that we have an authorized user. The first function we'll create is our get function, and we'll just use this syntax directly from Next.js. Within the get function, let's establish our connection to the database. Then we want to create a try catch block. The first thing we want to include inside of our try catch block is a variable to capture all posts, and we want to make sure that we populate the author ID as well. Then we want to return a response back with the status of 200, and equally important, make sure that we're returning all of the posts in a JSON format. And if we get any errors, we want to make sure that we're returning that error as well. The next function that we want to create is our post function. So let's go ahead and create the post function. Then we want to make sure that we have a connection to the database, and we should be seeing that this is coming from an authorized user. So we want to make sure that we are grabbing the access token from the headers, and then we want to work with that access token a little bit and decode it. And we're going to pass it in to verify JWT token, that JWT function that we created inside of the JWT lib. And if it doesn't have access, then we want to return a status of 403. But if there aren't any errors, then we want to go ahead and establish a try catch block. We want to grab the information from the body, which is going to be the title, the description, and the category. And then we want to have this information be what we call a new post, and we want to use the model that we imported to create a new post. Then we want to return this information back to the user as a status 201, and make sure that we're also capturing the new post information as well. And if anything, or if we get any errors, we want to make sure that we're returning a status of 500 so that the user is aware that we got an error. This is going to conclude our get and our post route within our post API directory. Now let's go ahead and move on to creating the individual post itself. So let's make sure we save first, and then let's close out the route.js. Inside of the API directory, inside of post, inside of the folder with brackets, we should have a file labeled route.js. And if you look at this file, the path for it should be route.js ID then post. And as long as you see that, then you know that you're in the correct route.js. So within our individual post ID route, we're going to have a few different functions. So let's start out by bringing in our database connection. Then we want to bring in the verify JWT token. We want to bring in our post model and our user model. The first endpoint that we want to set up, or route that we want to set up, is our get route. This is going to get the post by the ID itself. So first we want to start out with the connection to our database. Then we want to create a variable to grab the ID. Then we want to create a try catch block. Within that try catch block, we want to create a variable to find the post by the ID minus the password. Well, we want to find the post by ID, and let's go ahead and populate the author ID minus the password. And within it, if we capture it without any issues, we want to return a successful response. Otherwise, we want to make sure that we return the error back to the user. Then we want to establish a put connection. This is going to allow us to make updates to this individual route or to this individual post. First, as always, we need to start out with our connection to the database. We'll need to make sure that we grab the user ID, and we'll also need to make sure that the user is authorized in order to make these updates. We should have a token as well, and we want to make sure that we need to modify that token to fit our JWT. We also need to create a variable to access our verified JWT and pass in the token. And if there is no access token, we want to return back that the token has expired or unauthorized. Else, we'll need to create a try-catch block. First, we'll need to grab the information from the user. Then we'll need to create a variable to find the post by the ID. And if any of this information is missing, we want to return back to the user that, hey, only an authorized user can make an update to a post. Else, we'll need to create a variable to store the updated post. And if all goes well, return back to the user a status of 200. And if we get an error, return status of 500. Lastly, we'll need to create a function to delete posts individually by its ID. First, we'll start out with our connection to the database. We'll make sure that we grab the post by its ID. We'll need to confirm the access. We'll need to make some modification to the token itself. Let's bring in the verified JWT just to make sure that the user has access to delete this post. If no access, we'll return back that you're unauthorized or that the token has expired. Else, we'll create a try-catch block. We'll create a variable to grab the post. If we do not have a post ID or the user is not authorized, we'll return a message that only an author can delete the post. Else, we'll await the post and find it by ID. Then we'll return back to the user that the post has been deleted. If we get any errors, we'll return back to the user that, hey, we got an error in the response and here's the error. This will conclude all of the routes needed for our individual posts. I'll make sure that I have this. I know this is quite a bit of code. I'll make sure that I have this in the description if you'd like to access it, or just copy and paste it, or just confirm that it is correct. Now we'll go ahead and work on the like post route. So within the src directory API, let's navigate down to the individual post, and inside of the ID directory, we should have a like folder. The like folder should have a route.js. This is going to be if the user likes the post. Here's the endpoint in order to update our like. What we should have open is the route.js file that's within the like folder, that's within the ID folder, that's within post, that's within API. This is the endpoint for our like post. So within the route.js, we're going to need to have a few different routes or a few different functions set up based on the like route itself. The first one will be to actually like the post, and within the like route we'll need to create a function that will allow us to like the post. So let's start out by bringing in our database connection. Then we'll need to bring in the verified JWT function. Let's bring in the post model, and let's create the function that's going to allow us to put or update the like. We'll need to start with our database connection, create a variable to store our IDs, make sure that we are getting the correct access token authorization from the header, creating the token. Let's create a variable to decode the token as well that will hold our verified JWT token. If there's no access, let's go ahead and return back to the user that you're not authorized to like the post. Otherwise, we want to create a variable to store the post by ID. And then if the like already includes, so first, what this is saying is that if you already like this post, you're not going to be able to like it. Otherwise, we want to push the like based on this ID. That way we can store the likes by IDs and we don't have duplicate IDs. And we want to make sure that we're saving and returning back to the user that it was successful, but technically all you're going to see is just the like is now highlighted. If we get an error, we'll return back to the user our error. This is going to conclude the route to like a post. The next routes that we'll need, or final routes I should say, that we'll need to set up, it's going to be outside of our post. It's going to be actual comments. So we'll go ahead and work on that now. Within our API directory, we're going to create our last endpoint. Our last endpoint is going to be for our comments. So let's create a folder named comment. And within comment, let's create another directory named ID. And within the comment folder itself, not inside of ID, although we will need one, but not just yet, let's go ahead and create a route.js. So what we should see here is the comment and then the route.js that we have created directly inside of the comment directory or folder itself. So within our route.js, let's go ahead and bring in our database connection. Then we want to bring in our verify JWT function. Let's go ahead and bring in the comment model. Then let's create a function that's going to allow us to create posts or create comments, First, we'll need to establish the database connection. Then we'll need to grab the authorization access token. And then we'll need to decode it, very similar to what we've done in previous steps. And if the user is not authorized when they attempt to leave a comment, we're going to return back that you're not authorized or that your token has expired. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and grab the information that they've entered. We'll store it in a variable called new comment. And once we create that new comment, we want to make sure that we're populating the author ID. And then we just want to return that back to the user that it is successful. Otherwise, we'll need to return the error back to the user that we got an error message. And this is going to conclude the API to create a comment. The next route that we'll need to create within the comment itself is what's going to allow us to populate the comments and show all comments by post. So let's go back to our comment API directory, and within it we should have the folder that we just created named ID. Within the ID folder, let's create our last route.js file. So within the individual comment ID, similar to the post ID, we want to create a few different functions here that's going to allow us to manipulate our comments. The first one that we want to create is the get. So let's start out by importing our database, bringing in our verified JWT token, bringing in the comment model, and then let's create the function to get all comments on individual posts. So we'll make sure that we have our connection to the database, create a variable to grab the ID. Inside of it, we'll need to add a try catch block. First, we'll create a variable to grab all posts or all comments by ID and populate the author. Then if all is successful, we just want to return a status of 200 back to the user. If not, we'll return a 500. The next function is going to be to delete a comment. So this one is going to be a little more involved. Very similar to what we've done with posts. First, we'll need to establish the connection to the database. Once we have the connection to the database, we'll need to create a variable to grab the ID, the access token, and then we'll need to decode that access token and verify it, just as we've done with other user restricted options, Then if we don't have the access token or we couldn't decode the token, then we'll need to return that it has expired or they're unauthorized. Else, we'll need to create a try catch block. Then the try catch block, we'll need to create a variable to grab the comment. And if this comment does not have an author ID and they're not encoded, if they're not authorized, we'll need to return that only an authorized user can delete a post. Otherwise, we're going to grab that comment by ID, and then we're going to return a message back to the user that the post has been successfully deleted once we've grabbed it by ID. Else, we'll just return an error message back to the user that we were unable to delete the post. So now that concludes the backend setup for our full stack blog application. And the next upcoming videos, we'll work on all things front end, setting up the connection from the back to the front, and adding a little bit of life to our Next.js application. So I will see you in the next videos.